Guys, in this video, I'm going to unpack some basics on what it means to hear God's voice. It's coming up. Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Multiplying Disciples channel. My name is Mark. As always, it's great to be with you as we give you simple tips, tools, principles, and insights into what it looks like to multiply disciples, churches, and leaders until there is no place left that has not heard. And if you're new with us, I would invite you to subscribe to the channel, ring that bell, and leave a like on this video to help get this video out there farther and help it end up in your inbox. So, in this video, I want to dive into this topic of hearing God's voice. Now, I was talking with a couple of friends that are working and laboring in South Asia and have been for a number of years, and they were talking about just the role of hearing God's voice in training disciples and churches, and especially in a way that's gotten kind of fuzzy and foggy and can feel like a minefield sometimes when it comes to doing discipleship in our day and time. There's just a lot of things on the field around charismatic stuff and what does this look like to navigate the spiritual gifts in a healthy biblical way. So I want to dive into a series of videos here. I don't know if they'll all be consecutive, but I want to dive into this topic because it's important to talk about the spiritual gifts, because we want to, as my friend in South Asia said, to teach our disciples and churches the full counsel of God. And not only that, but I would put forward to you that hearing God's voice and operating in the spiritual gifts is the normal that we see in the life of Jesus and should be our normal. So if we're not discipling other disciples in this and operating in this, we're missing out on part of what it means to be a Christian. So a lot to that statement and a lot that we could unpack there, but won't start there. But in this first video, I want to unpack this idea of hearing God's voice as kind of a baseline as we begin to talk about spiritual gifts. There's a lot of different aspects to spiritual gifts that we could talk about, and even a lot of different spiritual gifts we could talk about. But I want to talk about hearing God's voice for yourself and then also for others in the first couple of videos, because that's so foundational for all of what it means to operate in spiritual gifts. So first, this story. So, a few years ago, I was helping out in Oklahoma City with a friend of mine who worked with high school students in a ministry called Youth for Christ. I love Youth for Christ. We've seen some really fun things happen in Oklahoma City through Youth for Christ, and I know a lot of great things happening more widely than that. But we were doing a campus club, which we did every week in multiple lunches, and it was coming to the end of the first semester, and it was time to end and go home for Christmas break and then come back again. So we were going to tell the Christmas story at one of the lunches and then share some snacks and hang out, and that was it. Well, we go to share the Christmas story in the first lunch, and at the end of it, my friend Drew, he's like, "Do you have any questions?" Well, hands are shooting up all over the room, and students are asking us very basic questions about the Christmas story, like, what do you mean Mary was a virgin? How could she be a virgin? What does that mean that she had a kid and she is a virgin? Very basic questions that somebody who has heard this story and grown up in Oklahoma, the Buckle the Bible Belt, should know the answers to. So we slowed down in lunch 2 and lunch 3 and shared the story. Same result, hands going up all around the room. Now here's the point. We can live in a culture where we're very saturated in biblical religious Christianity and assume that everybody knows about the Christian story. And so when we're sharing the gospel with them, we assume that they have grown up around the Bible. But that is presuming something that may not be true. And in fact, the opposite is often true for these students in this situation. They're going home to either abusive households or households that are fatherless and have no mom and dad at home, or have a lot of broken home life situations. And so they are the representation of a father, of a mother, of healthy friendships is all broken in their life. So the character of God, which is represented in our human relationships, is all broken for them. And not only that, they don't know the story that they're in. They don't know the Bible. They don't know what the Bible teaches about not only the Christmas story, but the basics of the gospel or any stories from the Bible. So to ask these students to hear God presumes a couple of things. In fact, I would say it presumes something for every single person when we begin to talk about hearing God's voice. It presumes two things: that you know the story that you're in and that you know the character of God. You know the story that you're in. You know the Bible. You know where the story started, and you know where we fit in right now into where the story is going. And then you know the character of God. So in John chapter 10, Jesus begins to talk with the Pharisees here. And I want to read part of this passage to you. So he tells the Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought them all out, when he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. Now, what I want to point out to you here is Jesus is talking in the context with some Pharisees about those that are his followers and those that are not. But we can learn a lot of things here about hearing God's voice. And he positions himself in this analogy as the shepherd and us as the sheep. Now, the character of a good shepherd, I don't know if you know this, but if you've ever been to Israel or you've seen what it looks like to bring sheep to market to sell, it's the guy going behind the sheep with a rod that's driving them to the market that is the guy who is the butcher going to kill the sheep. It's not the guy in front of the sheep. It's the guy behind the sheep. That's the butcher. The guy who goes out in front of the sheep and the sheep listen to his voice and walk behind him are the ones that know the voice of a trusted shepherd and have been with him long enough to know the patterns of what he's going to do. So Jesus here is giving us a very helpful analogy. And so to begin to hear God's voice, here's what I want to put forward to you. It's very important that we are positioned rightly. So Jesus is talking to them and saying, my sheep hear my voice. So first of all, our role is to be positioned as a sheep. A sheep doesn't face the other way and go away from the shepherd. The sheep understands that their role is sheep and he is the shepherd. They're going to follow and listen to his voice and do what he says to do. Now, if we're positioned in some other way, we're not going to be able to hear his voice. So step one is we got to be positioned. So if you are not yet a follower of Jesus, now there is common grace, and there's the reality that we can all have access to the counsel of God in some way. Romans 1 tells us this, that no one's without some account, because all of nature, Psalm 19 says this too, all of nature is declaring the reality of who God is. And yet, until we are fully positioned as his sheep, the voice of the enemy is coming in, and other voices from ourselves and from the world are all competing for us. So it's very important that we start as being positioned as sheep to hear his voice. We got to be faced towards the shepherd. And then he says, hear his voice. So positioning is absolutely critical as the first step. And then hearing his voice. Now that's where it becomes very important that we understand the full counsel of God, that we begin to know the book, to know the story. And that's why as we're beginning to disciple new Christians, it's very important we get them in the Word, saturated in Word, and especially saturated in the story of Jesus, to begin to know his character, to know the story of what Jesus has done, and to know what he may be doing today and where he's leading this story. All of those things are going to begin to position that sheep as a sheep to the shepherd, and to know the kind of voice that this good shepherd has, so that as they begin to hear all these different inputs, because they're going to hear inputs from a lot of other believers, they're going to hear inputs from their own heart and within themselves, they're going to hear inputs from the world, all these competing voices trying to tell them what they should be doing. So it's very important to start with that they are aware of the story that they're in, the character of God, and that they are listening and responding to him and learning how to do that. So then that'd be the other piece that I would add on there, is that we can be positioned rightly, we can know the story, we can know his character, but then there's also this element to which being practiced in recognizing or discerning, being able to pick up on, oh, that's God's voice or that's not, that resonates or lines up with his character. Galatians 6 talks about the fruit of the Spirit, or that doesn't. That comes with practice as well. And so part of the process of beginning to discern God's voice for ourselves and for others is being experienced in hearing his voice, knowing the story, and practicing picking up on what is his voice. Is he going to come with an audible voice like he has to some in Scripture? Jeremiah, that's how he came to him. Or is he going to come with angelic encounters, or like what he did with Ezekiel or John the Apostle in the book of Revelation? Is he going to come with this ecstatic encounter like Peter had, where the blanket came down out of heaven? Or is it going to be the still small voice like Elijah experienced? Well, most often it's going to be that. But that comes with practice as a new believer, where we need to have some time practicing hearing God's voice so that we can begin to become familiar. So that's, if you go back to this analogy of the sheep with the shepherd, the sheep is familiar. He's not just familiar with the character of this shepherd or spending time with him. He spent enough time and been around this shepherd long enough to know what kinds of things the shepherd says, the way the shepherd's voice sounds, and to know well enough that if another voice is coming in, that is not the shepherd. So it's important for us to spend time practically listening to hear God's voice, as well as time in the Word to be saturated in, especially the story of Jesus, and then be familiar with his character. So as you're getting started in this journey of spiritual gifts, or maybe you're already down that road and you want to talk about how do you train others, I want to point you to this passage in John 10 and talk about these important key elements as we begin to do this. So I've got some other videos on my channel for how to activate and train somebody in hearing God's voice, but these are the basic essentials. Got to know the story. You got to know the character of the God that you're following, and then it's going to take some practice. So that's where those videos come in, to practice to discern which voice is God's voice. Is that my voice? Is that the enemy's voice? Is that God's voice? Well, through practice, you can begin to discern that. And so those key elements together are going to set you up with the foundation, not only for hearing God, but for practicing spiritual gifts, which we will continue to unpack in future videos. So hope that's a helpful start for you guys. We'll keep talking about this. Please leave comments below if you want to talk through anything with this video specifically, or just as spiritual gifts. If you have questions about spiritual gifts, would love to unpack some of those things here in the days ahead. So I think that's it for today. Bless you guys. See you next time.